Vanessa Hale knew what this was the moment she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. It wasn't just another traffic stop. It was a ritual she'd come to expect the price of driving while black in a neighborhood that still whispered about belonging. Willow Bend, Tennessee, where the houses were white, the smiles were tight, and the eyes that followed her car carried questions too polite to be spoken aloud. She had lived here for 6 years, bought her home with her own money, served as a federal prosecutor, now ran a civil rights firm downtown. But none of that mattered when you were a black woman behind the wheel of a luxury car, alone, at twilight. She pulled over with practiced grace. No sudden moves, no panic. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because history had taught her that being right wouldn't always save you. Before the officer even opened his door, Vanessa reached for her phone, hit record, and placed it on the dash. Not because she wanted attention, because she wanted to record her version, not his. The patrol car door groaned open. She didn't look back. She already knew. White male, late 40s. Swagger like he owned the road. The type who didn't just wear the badge, he weaponized it. "License and registration," he said when he reached her window, tone clipped, unsmiling. She looked at him, really looked at him, the narrowed eyes, the hand hovering just a little too close to his holster, the quiet assumption that she didn't belong here. "My name is Vanessa Hale," she said calmly, "and before I reach for anything, I'd like to know why was I stopped." That's when his expression changed, slight, subtle, but unmistakable. She wasn't supposed to ask, she wasn't supposed to know, and most of all, she wasn't supposed to be unafraid. Deputy Marcus Redden didn't answer her question right away. He just stood there, eyes scanning her face, then drifting over her blazer, her gold bracelet, her skin. He was taking inventory not of a threat, but of a black woman who didn't look afraid, who didn't fit into the box he preferred. Submissive, apologetic, small. "You failed to signal back there," he said finally, like he'd picked the excuse out of thin air. Vanessa gave a slight nod, more for herself than for him. She had taken that turn for years. She knew her car's signals blinked like clockwork, but arguing facts wouldn't change anything, not with a man like him. Still, she wasn't going to play meek. "My license and registration are in my purse," she said, hands still on the wheel. "I'm going to reach for them now." Redden didn't nod. He just smirked. "Go ahead," he said slowly, "but make it careful." That smirk said everything. It wasn't caution, it was control. A man used to watching people scramble under his gaze. Vanessa wasn't scrambling. She moved deliberately, retrieved her documents, and handed them through the window. He took them, but didn't look. Not really. He lingered. "You live around here?" he asked, too casually. Vanessa didn't blink. "Yes, 5 blocks that way." Redden clicked his tongue. "You don't say." He glanced at the address again, as if double-checking. "What brings you through this part of town?" Vanessa let out a soft, humorless laugh. "My home, my husband, my life." Something in her voice made Redden's eyes narrow, the sharp edge of intellect, the absence of fear. It unnerved him. "Ma'am," he said, the word tight in his mouth, "I'm just doing my job." "No," Vanessa replied, meeting his stare. "You're not." The words landed between them like a dropped weapon. Redden's posture stiffened, his fingers flexing near his belt. For a moment, the air grew thick with unspoken tension, a war of silence, power meeting poise. And just like that, Vanessa knew. He hadn't stopped her because of a signal. He stopped her because she wasn't supposed to be seen here. Not like this, not in that car, not with that posture, not with that spine of steel. This was never about traffic. It was about who got to feel comfortable and who didn't. Deputy Marcus Redden walked back to his cruiser with her license and registration, but Vanessa knew better than to feel relieved. She didn't exhale. She didn't relax her grip on the steering wheel. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She watched him through the rearview mirror as he sat in his car, not typing, not checking, just watching her. There was something off about the way he lingered, something too still. Her phone was still recording, propped up on the dashboard, its lens angled just right. She'd hoped it would be enough, just the presence of a camera, to keep things from spiraling. But with men like Redden, sometimes being watched only made them worse. He stepped out again, slower this time. Vanessa's eyes stayed forward, her face calm, neutral. Her pulse, though her pulse was steady only because she'd trained it to be. Years in courtrooms had taught her how to hold her breath and wear serenity like armor. Redden returned to her window, leaning in just enough to invade her space. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked, tone slick with condescension. Vanessa blinked once. "Home." He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Funny. You don't look like someone who lives in this neighborhood." The implication hung in the air like smoke. She felt it burn behind her ribs, but she didn't flinch. "And you," she said coolly, "don't look like a cop who follows protocol." His smirk vanished. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, Redden's fingers began to drum on the edge of her car door, a slow, controlled rhythm. She could feel the shift, not just in him, but in the temperature between them. Something dark had moved closer. "You got an attitude," he said flatly. "No," Vanessa answered, voice even. "I have rights." His jaw tightened, and just like that, he reached for her door handle. But she was faster. A sharp click echoed inside her cabin as she locked it, milliseconds before his fingers landed. The look on his face changed, not shock, not anger, offense. He'd expected her to yield, to obey, to be manageable. Instead, she'd drawn a line, and he wasn't used to lines. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Vanessa stayed still. "On what grounds?" Redden's hand drifted low toward his belt, toward the holster. And Vanessa knew. This wasn't about compliance anymore. This was about control. And now, it was dangerously personal. For a moment, neither of them moved. Vanessa's hand hovered near the phone, but she didn't reach for it, not yet. Redden's fingers lingered near his hip, a silent threat barely cloaked in procedure. The silence was thick, the kind that comes before a storm or a shot. "I won't ask again," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of a man who wasn't used to being challenged. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "And I won't step out of my vehicle unless you provide a lawful reason." There it was again, defiance wrapped in poise, the kind that rattled men like Redden because it didn't raise its voice, didn't flinch, didn't kneel. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he growled. "No, Deputy," Vanessa replied. "You are." It was that moment, a quiet, deliberate refusal to yield, that pushed him over the edge. Without warning, Redden grabbed the door handle again. Locked. He rattled it once, then twice, his face hardening. His eyes flashed not with fear, but with humiliation. And then he reached for his weapon. Gasps echoed from somewhere behind her. Vanessa hadn't even realized neighbors were outside, drawn by the tension, the lights, the stillness that had become too loud to ignore. One man across the street raised his phone. Another, an older woman clutching a leash, froze mid-step. A teenage boy's voice cut through the quiet. "He's got his gun out!" Vanessa's heart pounded, but her face didn't change. She turned her phone, lifted it up clearly, visibly. "Badge number," she said, her voice louder now for them, not him. Redden hesitated for the first time. Just a flicker, but she saw it. So did the crowd. "I said step out of the car," he barked, gun now drawn but angled low, not quite aiming, not quite not. Vanessa didn't move. "Are you refusing to comply?" he snapped. She met his gaze, razor steady. "I'll step out. When you call your superior and explain that you just pulled a gun on Vanessa Hale, civil rights attorney, and wife of James Hale, Deputy Director of the U.S. Department of Justice." It landed like a slap. His mouth opened, but no sound followed. Then came another voice, sharp, commanding, unmistakable. "Deputy Redden, lower your weapon, now." From behind him, Captain Lewis Harlan stepped into view, and just like that, everything shifted. The silence that followed Captain Lewis Harlan's command was sharp enough to cut air. Deputy Redden didn't move right away. His hand still gripped the weapon, low at his side, his posture stiff, knuckles white. The badge on his chest gleamed under the street lamp, but for the first time that night, it looked smaller. "Redden," Harlan snapped again, stepping closer. "I said lower your damn weapon." The crowd was frozen, phones raised, breath held. No one dared speak. And finally, Redden blinked. He let out a sharp breath through his nose and slowly, reluctantly lowered his gun. Not holstered, just down. "Holster it," Harlan ordered, voice iron. With a tight jaw, Redden obeyed. Captain Harlan didn't look at him again. His eyes were on Vanessa now, and they softened just slightly. "Ma'am," he said, stepping beside her window. "Are you all right?" Vanessa, still seated, kept her focus locked on Redden. "I'd like my license and registration returned," she said calmly. Redden didn't move. "Hand them over," Harlan snapped without turning. Redden reached into his chest pocket with a hand that trembled and tossed the documents onto Vanessa's dashboard like they were trash. She didn't flinch. She picked them up with care and tucked them back into her purse. Then, slowly, deliberately, she shifted in her seat to face both men fully. "There's something he needs to hear," she said. Harlan hesitated. "Ma'am." "My name," Vanessa said clearly, her voice rising just enough for the growing crowd to hear, "is Vanessa Hale. I'm a civil rights attorney, and my husband is James Hale, Deputy Director of the U.S. Department of Justice." The words didn't echo, they landed. Redden's face drained of color, his mouth parted, a soundless response caught in his throat. Harlan froze, eyes flicking between the two. Vanessa held the moment like a lit torch. "And tonight," she continued, "Deputy Redden here pulled a firearm on me, for nothing." A woman nearby gasped. Someone whispered, "She's DOJ?" And just like that, the crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were witnessing. The moment shifted. Redden wasn't the authority here anymore, he was the problem. Vanessa picked up her phone and calmly ended the recording. She had everything she needed, and Redden had just lost everything he thought made him untouchable. Captain Harlan's jaw was tight as he stepped away from Vanessa's window, turning back to his subordinate with a stare that could carve stone. "You just pointed a weapon at the wife of the Deputy Director of the DOJ, he said, his voice low but heavy with restrained fury. "Are you out of your mind?" Redden didn't answer. Couldn't. His world had narrowed to the weight in his chest and the heat crawling up the back of his neck. The badge he'd worn for 23 years suddenly felt like it was burning into his skin. "She was being uncooperative," he muttered, eyes flickering to the phone still raised, the crowd still watching. Harlan's face darkened. "No, you escalated a routine stop into a damn national incident, and now you're done." The words hit harder than any slap. Redden opened his mouth, desperate to salvage control, but Harlan didn't give him the chance. "Dispatch," Harlan barked into his radio. "Notify Internal Affairs immediately. Deputy Marcus Redden is being placed on administrative leave, effective now." A pause, then the cold voice on the other end. "Copy that, Captain." Harlan stepped closer. "Badge and gun, now." The silence returned, heavy and absolute. Redden's hands trembled as he unhooked his belt, unholstered his firearm, and removed his badge. They clinked in Harlan's palm with the finality of a prison door slamming shut. "You're relieved of duty," Harlan said. "Leave the scene." Redden didn't look at Vanessa. He couldn't. He turned, stiff and silent, walking past the crowd that no longer feared him, past the cameras he used to ignore. Now, they recorded his walk of shame. Vanessa watched him go, her expression calm but unyielding. She wasn't interested in his humiliation. She was interested in the precedent. Harlan returned to her window, slower now. "Ma'am," he said, "on behalf of this department—" "I'm not here for apologies," she said quietly, cutting him off. "I'm here for accountability." Harlan nodded once, almost grateful. He understood. As the crowd began to thin and neighbors exchanged whispers, Vanessa started her engine. She didn't speed away. She drove like she always had controlled, alert, unapologetic. But as she turned the corner, her phone buzzed. Messages, missed calls. The storm had already begun. By morning, the name Marcus Redden would be everywhere, and the truth, already unstoppable. By the time Vanessa pulled into her driveway, her phone had turned into a grenade. Over 50 missed calls. Texts pouring in like a breached dam, colleagues, old classmates, journalists, activists, even strangers. Screenshots, links, news alerts. Her name already trending. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, unmoving. The house in front of her, with its dark brick and soft porch lights, had always been her sanctuary. But tonight, even home felt like a spotlight. The video had spread faster than she could have imagined. A shaky 2-minute clip, filmed from across the street, already had 500,000 views. The title? "Cop Pulls Gun on DOJ Official's Wife During Routine Stop." It was everywhere: CNN, Twitter, YouTube thumbnails, her voice calm and firm, demanding a badge number. Her face framed by the glow of her dashboard, unwavering. And behind her, Deputy Redden with a drawn gun and a hollow stare. She stepped out of the car slowly. The night air hit her skin like a whisper, reminding her that her body was still carrying the tension of what could have been. Inside, the house was quiet until the landline rang. Not her cell phone. The landline. She hesitated before answering. "Vanessa," came James's voice on the other end, measured, composed, but tight. Her husband had always kept calm under pressure, but she could hear the shift underneath. "Are you safe?" "I'm home," she said simply. A pause. "What's his name?" he asked, colder now. "It's being handled," she replied. "You should have called me." "I handled it." Another pause, then softer. "You didn't have to do this alone." Vanessa glanced at the TV in the living room. A news anchor was already dissecting the video frame by frame. "I wasn't alone," she said. "The world was watching." And it was. But not all eyes watching were friendly. Her inbox had already begun to fill with death threats mixed in with praise. People were picking sides, drawing lines, some calling her a hero, others accusing her of setting him up. And deep down, Vanessa knew this was only the beginning. She had spent her career defending others. But this time, she was the headline. She didn't ask for that. But now that it had arrived, she wasn't running from it either. The morning after the incident, Vanessa Hale woke to a storm. Her inbox had quadrupled in size. Her voicemail was full. Requests for interviews flooded in from national outlets, civil rights panels, even a late-night talk show host who wanted her to share her truth. But Vanessa wasn't chasing attention. She was chasing accountability. She declined most offers, but won an interview with The Ledger, a reputable, no-nonsense investigative outlet she agreed to. Not for fame, for clarity. For all the voices that didn't get to explain themselves before becoming a hashtag. She sat across from the journalist in a clean studio with black walls and sharp lighting. Her voice was steady, her story precise. No theatrics, no anger, just truth. "I wasn't afraid of him," she said. "I was afraid of what he thought he could get away with." Meanwhile, Marcus Redden sat alone in his kitchen, blinds drawn, the TV muted as talking heads discussed his name. His badge, his face, his record all dissected in real time. He had once believed the system would always back him. He played by its rules. He upheld its codes. And yet now, his phone hadn't rung once, not from his union, not from his captain, not even from the few officers who used to grab beers with him after patrol. He was a liability now, a blemish. His wife had taken their son to her mother's. His lawyer hadn't returned his last 2 calls. The silence around him was louder than the sirens he used to flip on without question. Across the screen, Vanessa's face appeared confident, intelligent, composed. "She made you look weak," he muttered to no one, "just because you hesitated." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He didn't hesitate soon enough. Back at the studio, the interviewer leaned forward. "Do you want him fired?" Vanessa paused. "I want him accountable," she said. "Not just for what he did to me, but for what officers like him have done to women who didn't get the chance to speak afterward, to families still waiting for justice." The clip went viral within the hour. Some called her a hero. Others accused her of destroying a man's career. But Vanessa wasn't trying to be either. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to be heard. The city council chamber was packed. Cameras lined the back walls. Reporters whispered into microphones. Residents filled the rows, their eyes fixed on the single empty chair at the center table, Vanessa's seat. She entered without a word, dressed in navy blue, spine straight, jaw set. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to testify. The council had convened a special hearing in response to the national uproar. The agenda: investigate the actions of Deputy Marcus Redden. The real agenda: gauge public pressure, contain the fallout, manage optics. Councilwoman Dana Parrish sat at the head of the panel, mid-50s, blonde, tailored in beige, a political survivor. Known for her polite moderation, she was the kind of leader who believed in both sides, even when one side had a gun in their hand. "Ms. Hale," Parrish began smoothly, "thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a fact-finding session, not a criminal trial." Vanessa met her gaze. "Respectfully, Councilwoman, it may not be a trial. But for many of us, encounters like mine feel like one where we're presumed guilty for simply existing in the wrong zip code." A murmur rippled through the room. Parrish pressed on. "We understand your experience was uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Vanessa's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. He drew a weapon. On an unarmed woman. Without cause. "Yes, well, emotions were high and context matters." Vanessa leaned forward, voice cold and exact. "The only thing that was high was his sense of entitlement." Another ripple, this time louder. "I've worked with law enforcement for years," she continued. "I know the weight of a badge. I also know what happens when it's abused." Parrish shifted, clearly thrown off balance. So you're saying you believe Deputy Redden is dangerous? I'm saying, Vanessa replied, that systems protect the dangerous when they're uncomfortable holding them accountable. Silence. No one spoke. Then, slowly, members of the audience began to nod. Someone clapped, then another. Parrish looked away, scribbling notes she'd never read again. Vanessa sat back, not triumphant, but grounded. She hadn't come for vengeance. She had come for clarity. And in that moment, it was clear. The room was no longer hers to convince. It was theirs to remember. The vote wasn't close. By unanimous decision, the City Council moved to formally recommend the termination of Deputy Marcus Redden and the opening of a federal civil rights investigation into his conduct. The recommendation, though symbolic, sent a message louder than any press release. Within 24 hours, the Sheriff's Department issued an official statement. Redden was dismissed from service, his certification flagged statewide. Internal Affairs confirmed that body cam footage had been reviewed and matched every detail Vanessa had testified to. There would be no quiet exit, no sideways reassignment. His career was over. Vanessa didn't attend the press conference. She had already said what needed to be said. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed that evening, finally out of heels, finally out of the camera's eye. The house was still. Her husband James was downstairs, fielding calls from DC, trying to manage the story from the other side of the system. Vanessa wasn't interested in headlines anymore. She stared at her phone, scrolling past thousands of notifications, messages from strangers, women sharing their own stories, parents thanking her for showing their daughters what strength looks like. But there were others too. Hateful, venomous, anonymous. Voices clinging to a world where men like Redden were still heroes. She let the screen go dark. Because she hadn't done it for the comments, not for the cameras, and not even for Redden. She had done it for the women who never made it home, for the ones who didn't get to speak their names in a courtroom or on a city council floor, for the mothers who buried silence with their daughters. Vanessa inhaled slowly. Her shoulders softened, not in surrender, but in release. It was done. Justice didn't always come fast. It didn't always come clean. But tonight, it had come. Her phone buzzed again, a message from a number she didn't recognize. Thank you for not flinching, for not backing down, for being who you are. Vanessa let herself smile just a little, not because she'd won, but because, for once, the right person had lost. In a world where power often goes unchecked, the line you crossed reminds us that dignity is not something granted by a badge or a title, it's something we carry within. Vanessa Hale didn't fight back with anger or chaos. She stood firm with clarity, calm, and conviction. And in doing so, she reminded us all that true strength isn't loud, it's steady. For those of us who've lived long enough to see patterns repeat, this story is both familiar and urgent. It teaches us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but speaking up doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes, the most powerful resistance is quiet, legal, and unshakable. We must pass on to our children and grandchildren not just stories of hardship, but examples of grace under pressure. Vanessa didn't just protect herself, she lit a path for others. In our own lives, we may not face a patrol car or a drawn weapon, but we will face moments where we must choose between comfort and courage. May we choose courage, with wisdom, with resolve, and with the quiet knowledge that doing the right thing leaves a legacy far beyond ourselves. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.